Hello and welcome to a brand new edition of DevOps World. In this edition, we are going to look at KEDA. KEDA stands for Kubernetes Event-Driven Autoscaling, right? Typically, when we talk about Kubernetes, most people are aware of how to scale their pods based on memory and CPU, right? So you set those thresholds and you set the scaling policies and so on and so forth. But KEDA is for real world, right? So the real world scaling depends upon lots of factors outside of, not necessarily limited to uh, memory and CPU. Like for example, there might be a queue or messaging queue that is flooded with messages, and the Kubernetes deployment has to kind of respond to that, influx of messages, right? There might be a bunch of objects that are created in S3 bucket, and those needs to be processed, and autoscaling needs to happen, right? So these are factors outside of the typical memory and CPU kind of thresholds, right? So in this episode, we can look at how KEDA can be leveraged to scale your pods based on real world scenarios. Like for example, in this case, we are going to look at, we'll do a demo in which we'll look at how to scale your deployment based on messages in an SQS queue. The video assumes some basic familiarity with AWS services like SQS, IAM, and so on. But even if you don't know, you can get the kind of gist of the video. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll have a demo, and you can see how KEDA scales your workloads based on external factors like a queue being flooded with the messages and so on and so forth. So let's look at the scenario that we are going to do. So let's first look at the various components, right? The first is the queue producer, which is a deployment that's going to actually post messages onto this SQS queue. Then there is a queue consumer that's going to actually read messages from the SQS queue. Then we deploy KEDA. What KEDA does is KEDA actually kind of has the privilege to read from this queue and then scale the queue consumers based on the number of messages in this queue. So the first thing that happens is, and we also kind of deployed two manifest files, the scale object manifest file and the service account. So let's look at that. First, when we deploy all these things, the first thing that happens is KEDA looks at these two manifest files, right? Actually, the scale object manifest file. The service account is basically just the IAM role association with the service account, so that KEDA can actually read metrics from this queue. Queue producers can write to the queue, and the queue consumers can read from the queue. So all of them, for the sake of this video, are going to be using this particular service account. So now, what does KEDA do first? It looks at the scale object YAML file that's deployed. So what is a scale object YAML file, right? The scale object actually specifies which deployment to scale. So which is queue consumer deployment. Then here is the threshold, right? So it says, hey, what maximum replica count should be 5 of the queue consumer, and the polling interval is every 10 seconds, right? And it's telling what type of things to trigger on, which is basically the queue over here, SQS queue, and it's providing the queue URL. And the queue length threshold here is 5, right? So whenever the queue has more than 5 messages, KEDA is going to scale the queue consumer to consume messages from the queue, rather drain the queue. And what is the identity owner? Identity owner is operator. Operator in the sense KEDA has the privilege to be able to scale or to be able to read and so on. So identity owner is the KEDA operator. Okay. So let's see how this works, right? Now, KEDA basically reads, the first thing that it, as I said, is first it basically kind of, looks at the scaled object and it understands what it needs to do. So we just saw the scaled object here. And the second is basically it starts monitoring this queue for metrics. And then the next step is the queue producer actually kind of in this demo, he's going to actually post messages into this queue. Then the moment these messages actually breach the threshold, what happens is that KEDA operator launches the queue consumer or actually scales the queue consumer deployment. So when the queue consumer deployment is scaled, the message queue is drained and messages are kind of, retrieved from this and processed. So the queue comes back to zero, or at least it keeps continuing in this phase until the producer stops producing. So once the producer stops putting messages, KEDA operator recognizes that there are no more messages in the queue and it will scale down the consumer deployment. So what just happened here, right? Now you are actually kind of scaling based on only the demand that is there, right? And otherwise your kind of infrastructure is setting basically kind of, not being used. So you're saving money, right? So this is a great approach if you want to save cost on your infrastructure cost in AWS and so on. And also in the description section, there are basically links to the videos wherein I have posted about IRSA, which is the service account which follows the principle of basic what you call as principle of least privilege. And also there is Carpenter. There's a video link for Carpenter as well, which you find useful if you want to use KEDA and Carpenter to contain your infrastructure costs, right? So let's get started with a demo. And then if you actually are watching this video right now, please make it a point to subscribe so that you can get notified whenever there are new videos. And please feel free to share with your friends. Thank you. Get started with the demo. So we have the Kubernetes cluster created and we have KEDA installed on it. All the KEDA pods are running fine. And then we have the queue created. So this is the queue we're going to focus on. And as discussed, we will deploy the producer, consumer, and also the scale object. So let's get started with deploying the producer. So this just does nothing but pumps hello world messages into the queue. So this is going to be deployed with 0 pods. It's scaled to 0 replicas. So you will not see anything until we start it. So first is we deploy the KEDA producer. So you can see that it is deployed here. And then we will deploy the consumer. So let's do the consumer here, KEDA consumer. Okay. And we also need to deploy the scale object. So the scale object is the most critical component here because it tells KEDA which queue to look for metrics and what object to scale. And also it has a kind of, the privileges that it needs. The scale object tells KEDA what kind of privileges it should use to kind of monitor the queue, right? So we create the scale object as well. So now what we are going to do is we have all the components created. So the first thing we are going to do is we'll scale. In this demo, what we'll do is we'll scale the producer, and the producer is going to start pumping messages into this queue. We don't need to scale the consumer because that's what KEDA does. The moment KEDA sees that the messages in the queue breaches the threshold, it then starts to autoscale. The consumer. Okay. So I think there were some messages from the previous thing that I was working on. So don't worry about this. Our threshold is set to 10. So we should be fine. Oh, okay. Now it's 0. Okay. So those have been drained. So let's start pumping messages. So let me scale. I'll give it like 3 pods. So it's much easier to kind of see what's going on. So all 3 pods will start pumping messages into the queue. So we have the consumer started up. So, the producer. And let's see, the producer is initializing, and then it should start pumping messages into the queue. Okay, so this is just hello from the producer. So there are messages that are going in. Now let's look at, now just you don't have to watch this queue because KEDA is watching this queue. So just watch the consumers uh, and see there are 7 messages already. So yeah, you see what just happened, right? So KEDA detected that there are messages in the queue, and it started, to scale the consumer. So now there is one consumer pod, right? So the consumer is reading messages. We did not scale the consumer. KEDA did that automatically, right? So it's consuming these messages from the queue. So then what we can do is, as the last part of the demo, let's scale this down to 0. So if we scale this down to 0, then KEDA should determine, and this should pretty much kind of, make sure when you scale this down to 0, there should not be any messages in the queue. And when there are no more messages in the queue, KEDA should automatically scale the consumer down to 0. So let's scale this down to 0. The producer is no longer putting messages in the queue. So just watch the consumer. So it takes some time for KEDA to kind of detect that there are no messages in the queue. So let's do a refresh here. So yeah, now it's 0. So now just watch this consumer go away. So give it a minute. So we have a cooling period. So it's kind of, honoring that cooling period, and then you should see it go down. Yeah, you just saw the pod go away, and the consumer is down, scaled down to 0. So I hope you enjoyed this video on KEDA. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on the video, and please like and share, and also don't forget to subscribe.